Much like the ghosts that haunt the houses on TV screens, the screams of the damned and the stench of decay continue to echo through the realm of reality. The only difference is that the monsters in this case take the form of friendly faces, enact war, chant the words of madness, and create unyielding legacies of pure horror. Number 10. Methyl isocyanate is a colorless, odorless, flammable, explosive, and corrosive toxic liquid. While it sounds almost like a chemical weapon of war, the substance has a far more commercial use. Methyl isocyanate is a carbamate pesticide used solely for pest prevention that evaporates immediately upon exposure to air, making it undetectable. If a person were to come into contact with this substance, though, pure horror is bound to unfold. Inhalation of the toxin can lead to cough, chest pain, pulmonary edema, bronchial spasms, and more. Exposure to skin causes chemical burns, watery eyes, eye pain, lid edema, and corneal ulcerations. Contact with this pesticide can lead to long-term incurable health issues, and there exists no antidote for exposure to methyl isocyanate, because no person is supposed to come in direct contact with it. Yet this is exactly what happened in December of 1984. Union Carbide India Limited had erected a pesticide plant on the outskirts of Bhopal, India, a city with a population in the hundreds of thousands. The pesticide plant had been there for some time, and no one could have imagined the pure terror it could have caused. Believing they were safe and sound in their homes, the residents headed off to bed on the evening of the 2nd. Meanwhile, on the outskirts, the seams of a storage tank holding methyl isocyanate began to leak, spewing more than 40 tons of the toxin into the area. Of course, it was undetectable and was only noticed when the symptoms of exposure began to set in. The toxic gas cloud hung low and slowly drifted into the residential areas. By midnight, the 3rd of December, residents would be clutching at their throats, choking, trying to breathe. Each gasp only made things worse. Within just hours, the population was in a steep decline. Hundreds would succumb to the effects of the gas that day, with 10,000 meeting their demise within 3 days after the outbreak. It was a terrifying tragedy, one that would become known as the most fatal industrial disaster in the world, that neither started nor ended that fateful day. No one wanted to admit it at the time, but this event was 100% preventable, if not for technical failures, corporate malpractice, and human error. The seeds of the Bhopal disaster were sown 15 years earlier when the pesticide plant was built. At the time, India was undergoing a green revolution, driven by a growing population and the need to feed it. Initially, methyl isocyanate was imported to the plant, but in 1980, 4 years before the disaster would strike, the substance began being manufactured at the site itself. Safety regulations, though, didn't materialize with this new section. A medical officer at the factory, Kumkung Madwell, even stated that the operation at the plant was a case study on how not to do things. Trainees taking on the complex tasks of experienced officers made the factory susceptible to disaster, and eventually the shortcuts, poor management, lack of safety regulations, and ill-equipped staff culminated in that evening's disaster. Employees discovered the leak at 11:30 that night, but no one knew how long it had been in this condition for. It would ultimately remain in that condition for several more hours, even as the on-duty supervisor ignored the warnings from employees. Allegedly, he dismissed the leak, claiming it was only water or condensation, and that he would deal with it after an apparent tea break. It's hard to imagine that something as simple as a tea break could lead to such devastation. Over the next few short years, 22,000 more fatalities as a direct result of the disaster were added to the list. Hundreds of thousands that survived weren't better off. They were forced to live a life of pain, riddled with cancer and other diseases, another result of the incurable effects of methyl isocyanate exposure. Number 9. It was when Britain declared war on France in May of 1803 that the onslaught of the Napoleonic Wars began. The war erupted over mounting concerns about Napoleon's growing power and the influence he wielded over Europe's territories. 2 years after the war had begun, several battles would take place. The Battle of Ulm, the Battle of Caldiero, the Battle of Friedland, the Peninsular War, the Battle of Wagram, the Battle of Borodino, the Siege of Pamplona, the 6 Days Campaign, the Battle of Toulouse, and the Battle of Ligny are just a few of the 40 to 50 conflicts that Napoleon was involved in. The Napoleonic Wars wouldn't come to an end until over a decade later, in 1815, with the defeat of the Emperor of the French in the Battle of Waterloo. This conflict was fought during the 100 days of Napoleon's restoration, near the village of Waterloo. 72,000 French troops combined with the Duke of Wellington's 68,000 and 45,000 Prussians made up Napoleon's army. Despite the high number of soldiers, though, the emperor was defeated, ending the years of recurrent warfare. But with many troops on the numerous battlefields strewn across the continent, many wonder what happened to all those bodies. The brutalities of war would spare almost no one, leaving the grounds red-stained and coated in a layer of humans. As if war wasn't atrocious and distressing enough, what happened to the remains of the fallen would only cause further disfigurement. Obviously, with bodies piling up, leaders had to figure out what to do with them all, and burying them would be far too humane and time-consuming. So instead, it was left up to scavenging. Soldiers often had the first pick. They riddled through the deceased and wounded, looting clothing, weapons, and valuables, and soon it wasn't just their possessions that were taken. A tool that soon dominated the battlefields was the teeth-pulling pliers. Looters ripped the teeth from the fallen and sold them to the denture-making market. Following the Battle of Waterloo, teeth began to flood the market, so much so that they became known as the Waterloo Teeth, and they were proudly advertised as such. The rest of the remains would be left to wildlife or set ablaze, only for scavengers to return months later to finish the job. With bones picked clean, the skeletal remains were collected as if they were nothing more than stones or seashells, and through this, they were given a new purpose. The bones of the fallen troops on either side of the battlefield were being recycled. If dentures weren't disturbing enough, fertilizer companies began buying up the remaining bones, contracting scavengers to collect them. They would then be ground into dust and used as fertilizer. Waterloo wasn't the only battlefield that was looted for this purpose. This may be why there were so few skeletal remains left in these locations, even with a high mortality rate. The fertilizer, complete with human bone meal, would subsequently be used for crops that would later feed both livestock and the growing human population. Said population hadn't consumed the remains of the fallen unknowingly either. Solidifying the truly disturbing nature of this event was an 1822 British newspaper report that claimed that human bones made incredible soil, and, quote, "The good farmers of Yorkshire are in great measure indebted to the bones of their children for their daily bread." Number 8. Those who are vegan are often presented with the question, if you were abandoned on an island with nothing else to eat but a pig, would you? As a counter question, if you and the expedition of several pioneers were misled into heavy snow and stranded with nothing to eat but each other, would you? It was this very scenario that the Donner Party would be faced with in the harsh, unforgiving winter of 1846. The story, though, starts sometime before that, specifically in the summer of that year, when western-bound fever, the compulsion to move away from the western homes, where many seemingly felt trapped, had been making its way across the United States. Residents of Springfield, Illinois, found themselves plagued by this fever and sought life elsewhere. Eventually, they set their sights on California, leaving behind the Midwest. That summer, 89 people formed what would become known as the Donner Party, consisting of 31 members of the Donner and Reed pioneering families. The wagon train departed from Springfield and made its way to Fort Bridger, Wyoming, when the disastrous decision was made to deviate from the path. The party opted to try out a recently created trail, the Hastings Cutoff, made by Lansford Hastings. George Donner was subsequently placed in charge of the party as they departed from Fort Bridger that July. The term shortcut would be used as an antonym to Hastings Cutoff because it was nothing of the sort. Instead, it set the Donner Party back a whole 3 weeks, costing them much-needed supplies. They suffered greatly in the Wasatch Mountains, the Great Salt Lake Desert, and the Humboldt River, but seemingly emerged unscathed. By October, they would reach the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it was now fall on the cusp of winter. The decision was made to camp out at Truckee Lake, located in the high mountains, where an early winter storm would bring a blanket of snow. The following morning, the party realized that they were trapped and unable to move forward. The lake was subsequently renamed Donner Lake for the tragedy that unfolded shortly after. A great portion of the expedition remained there, while the Donner family headed 6 miles away to Alder Creek and set up a camp there. They made makeshift tents and slaughtered the oxen for food, hoping for a thaw that was never going to come. Another 15 members would head out on snowshoes, hoping to reach Sutter's Fort. They would become known as the Forlorn Hope. It was now the middle of December, the dead of winter. Harsh weather and a lack of supplies left the now dispersed expedition struggling to survive. Many succumbed to the harsh weather, others starved, and a select few found themselves considering that disturbing question. If you and an expedition of several pioneers were misled into heavy snow and became stranded with nothing to eat but each other, they did. Cannibalism was used as a last resort for the remaining pioneers, and by the end of it all, only 48 remained. Number 7. The dystopian thriller Dreamland, set in the 1930s, depicts a small town ravaged by drought and dust storms, mirroring the actual harrowing event known as the Dust Bowl. This ecological disaster was exacerbated by the Great Depression, which began in 1929, and poor land management on the Great Plains following the Civil War. Within a 150,000 square mile area, including Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, erosion, overgrazing, and land clearance turned lush farmland into a desolate wasteland. By 1930, the exposed earth was cracked and dry, leading to the first 4 major drought episodes that marked the start of the Dust Bowl. As crops failed, black blizzards, or massive dust storms, swept the region. The dust was so thick it blocked the sun, reducing visibility to 0 and suffocating all remaining life. Residents described the Great Wall of Dirt as alive, and people inhaled substantial amounts of dust, damaging their lungs and even their stomachs. In 1932, 14 dust storms were reported, increasing to 38 the following year. Families struggled to survive, resorting to using earwax as lip balm and eating dandelion salads. Makeshift camps spread disease like typhoid and smallpox, and food was contaminated. Victims named the decade-long ordeal Hell on Earth. The 4 major droughts occurred in rapid succession: 1930 to 31, 1934, 1936, and 1939 to 1940. With only sporadic minor aid, many residents were forced to flee, becoming refugees. The rains eventually returned, ending the drought, though the damage was permanent. While the country recovered from the Great Depression, and the plains became golden with wheat again, the Dust Bowl remains one of the worst man-made ecological disasters to date. Number 6. World War I began in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, adding to the already rising international tensions. While overshadowed by the Western Front, fighting on the Eastern Front was often more brutal. Here, a strange battle at the Auschwitz Fortress in July of 1915 permanently altered German perceptions of the Russians. The Auschwitz Fortress, now in Poland, was built in the late 1800s to protect the Russian Empire from German invaders. Despite its strategic location, surrounded by marshland, General Paul von Hindenburg led 14 battalions of 8,000 soldiers in an attack, utilizing new chemical weapons. Among the 30 batteries at his disposal were some containing a deadly bromine and chlorine gas mix. On August 6th, the Germans deployed the gas, destroying all life in its path. approximately 900 Russian soldiers, lacking proper gas masks or protection, were forced to cover their faces with cloth. When the Germans ceased fire, they expected no survivors, but instead they were shocked to see the gassed Russian soldiers, scarred, coughing up blood and tissue and looking zombie-like, charging toward them. Terrified by the sight of this living army of the unalived, the Germans retreated in fear, some stumbling into barbed wire, and by the time they fled, only a few Russians remained to fire on their attackers. The chemical weapons failed to achieve the German objective of total destruction. The Russians later dismantled the Osijek fortress, realizing the situation was hopeless, and the exposed soldiers eventually succumbed to the gas's effects. The site remains a chilling testament to this horror movie-like historical event. Number 5. During the 19th century, the Hatchers were viewed as the most important family in Pikeville, Kentucky. James Hatcher was a wealthy landowner and a prominent businessman. He was married to a young local woman, Octavia Smith, the daughter of Jacob Smith, an early settler. In 1891, the pair welcomed Jacob Hatcher into the world, named after Octavia's father. The child lived only a few days before succumbing to unspecified complications. It was thereafter that the grieving mother would retire to her bed, suffering not only from depression of losing her baby, but also from an illness that would take a turn for the worse that year in April. And eventually, Octavia was pronounced deceased. Due to the southern heat, she was buried in haste, without being embalmed. The community and her husband mourned the unfortunate loss. Not long after the burial, others began showing signs of the same illness. Many curled up like fists protesting their coming demise, only to fall into a deep sleep. Research conducted by medical officials suggested that the illness was some kind of sleeping sickness. The sufferers were treated as best as possible, and eventually many of them would awaken from their comatose state. The culprit would later only be identified as encephalitis, which sees symptoms of headache, fever, confusion, seizures, paralysis, and eventually coma. As victims of the illness began to recover without lasting effects, news began to spread, and Octavia's family would come to have a daunting realization. Perhaps Octavia wasn't deceased after all. In the same amount of haste used to bury her, the woman was retrieved from her grave, and when the coffin was reopened, pure horror lay within. It appeared that the coffin had not been sealed properly, allowing oxygen to still enter. At some point, the believed to be deceased woman would awake from her coma, with enough air to last mere days. Realizing she'd been buried alive, Octavia was sent into panic, evident by the shredded lining of her casket and her red-stained fingernails. Her face had also been scratched, and instead of leaving the world with the peaceful expression she had upon burial, her features were now contorted into a countenance of horror and fear. Number 4. It's the legends of the Titanic, Lusitania, and Mary Celeste, and the USS Cyclops that cast a shadow over the greatest maritime disaster in history. Obscured by the more sensational events is the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster, an incident that took place in the throes of the Second World War. The ongoing war is undoubtedly filled with superlatives like fastest, bravest, strongest, but mostly dominated by negative connotations like lethal, devastating, destructive, and disastrous. It would be all these words that wouldn't only describe the war, but would also be used in a singular tragic event that happened in its midst. It was late January 1945, several months before the Second World War would draw to a close, but not before more devastation was unleashed. It was that month when the Wilhelm Gustloff, a 25,000-ton German ocean liner, named for the leader of the Swiss totalitarian party, would set sail. Its mission was to evacuate what was left of the German military, as well as civilian refugees from the eastern provinces of Prussia. The mission would be named Operation Hannibal and would depart Poland with 10,000 people on board. The route would take the Wilhelm Gustloff across the Baltic Sea, an area from which it would never escape. The vessel was doomed from the moment it left port, where it had been stationed for several years, serving as a floating barrack after serving as the cruise liner for the Strength Through Joy program in the 30s. tensions of course were still ongoing, and any Germanic vessel would be seen as a threat. Those in charge of the mission could only hope that they wouldn't run into any enemies. By nightfall, though, that hope would fall short. At around 6 p.m., a message was brought to the captain, warning him of a minesweeper convoy that was heading their way. This message prompted him to activate the navigation lights, preventing a collision. Strangely, though, no one would figure out where the message had come from. The radio operators on board the Gustloff and the Low had not received such a message. It was theorized that it may have been an act of sabotage. Activating the navigation lights would make the vessel visible to all, including enemies. At 7 p.m., a Soviet submarine, the S-13, penetrated the surface of the water. Enemy forces spotted the Wilhelm Gustloff, and right then and there, the Soviets launched 4 torpedoes, 3 of which hit the target. At first, those on board weren't sure what hit them. Did they run into the ice, a reef, a hidden piece of land? As the ocean liner began to dip below the surface and fill with water, it became clear that something far worse had happened. There were obviously gaping holes in the ship's body now, and nothing could be done. Slowly, it sank, with 10 people on board, and not enough lifeboats to save them all, with many rescue appliances frozen to the deck. Number 3. Rudyard Kipling witnessed the horrors of the Second Boer War, which inspired his poem, Boots. A supporter of British imperialism, Kipling arrived in South Africa in 1900, but was too ill to fight. He observed Lord Roberts leading 60,000 men on forced, monotonous marches involving a scorched earth policy, burning farms and homes to deprive the Boers of support. This led to widespread destruction and the forced relocation of many South Africans to camps, causing immense loss of life on both sides. Kipling documented the troops' mental torment and exhaustion. Initially celebrating imperialism, he quickly realized the inescapable brutality of war, even hallucinating the sound of marching feet. The constant strain led to 22,000 British casualties and lasting psychological effects like debility syndrome. The war also claimed the lives of 40,000 to 50,000 Boers, many of them civilians who died from starvation and disease in the camps. The devastation led to a public outcry against the humanity inflicted on both South Africans and British troops, embarrassing the government and forcing a restructuring of the army. Known in South Africa as the South African War, the conflict is considered the most destructive and formative in its history, leaving behind a legacy of fear, trauma, and unforgettable sounds of boots. Number 2. The year was 1530, and Protestant thought was making its way across Europe as it had so done, unaltered for the past 1,000 years. In the eye of the unyielding storm was Munster, Germany. It would be gripped by the same fear that had struck either areas of the country, France and the Netherlands. Those fears circulated around religious anxieties and the looming Protestant Reformation that would create significant tensions with newly implemented doctrines and practices. Lingering with this concept was also instability linked to threats perceived as being supernatural, curses, or demonic possession, such as the dancing plague that dominated the era. The growing concerns and takeover would set the stage for a revolution, with priests preaching apocalyptic sermons that only fanned the flames of war. 1534 marked the 4th year of the Anabaptist takeover, during which radicalists attempted to establish a communal sectarian government. The leaders of the guild would take to the streets, screaming at the citizens, ordering them to repent, preaching sermons and causing waves of mass hysteria. The cult took over Munster and established social changes that were extreme and daunting, leading to widespread suffering and a red-stained history. At the helm of it all were radical figures Bernard Knipperdoling, Jan van Leyden, and Bernard Krechting. It would be these figures who forced women into polygamy, making it compulsory, starved the people of the city, expelled dissenters, and executed them as they attempted to establish an autocratic theocracy. Such a totalitarian government would view the singular leader as a divine entity, with laws and state affairs determined by religious doctrine rather than the will of the people. For over a year, spiritual belief intersected with political government, transforming the life of a community that was against such reforms that had caused such violence and demise across the city. Then, in June of 1535, the tables would abruptly turn. The Anabaptist cult had chosen the wrong city, and Munster banded together, pushing back against the leaders with the people they had left, with 30,000 people having succumbed to the impact of the year-long siege. The besiegers that remained managed to penetrate the protective walls of the cult leaders, capturing John van Leyden and several others, imprisoning them before exacting the same amount of brutality that they had been shown during the takeover. The leaders were brutally tortured right in the city marketplace for everyone to see. After being burned alive, those who didn't expire would have their tongues pulled from their mouths with tongs, and finally, to end their suffering, a heated dagger would be thrust into their heart. When Munster was satisfied with the torture and execution of the leaders and had taken back control of the city, they would construct 3 cages, one for Van Leyden, one for Nipperdole, and one for Krechting. Their remains were placed within the iron, a permanent cage that would be hung from St. Lambert's church tower. The disturbing sight served as a warning to the rebels. The cages were briefly removed after 50 years, but rehung following repairs on the tower. In 1944, another harrowing event would leave the structure severely damaged, with 2 of the prisons falling to the ground, and the 3rd remaining ominously in place. Again, they were rehung, and later 3 yellow bulbs were placed inside them in commemoration, and continued to serve as a gruesome reminder of the Munster Rebellion that marred the 1500s and left many innocent individuals brutalized and deceased. Number 1. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union under Stalin sought to expand its population and farmland, opting to relocate prisoners from overcrowded jails to new collectivized farms in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Following initial success, in February 1933, the OGPU and Gulag heads proposed deporting 2 million more undesirables for labor. Cities like Moscow began issuing internal passports to single out people for deportation. Between March and July 1933, almost 86,000 people were taken from Moscow. 4,800 were sent to a supposed special settlement on Nazinski Island. This was propaganda. The island, only 1.9 miles long and 660 yards wide, offered no shelter, tools, or food for the 4,500 men and over 300 women who arrived on May 18th of 1933. They were dumped with only 20 tons of flour. Conflict erupted immediately as prisoners fought guards for the flour. Leaders hoarded it, and those who consumed it with river water suffered dysentery. Realizing the horror, Stalin canceled the Nazinski Gulag plan, but it was too late. Prisoners tried to escape on flimsy rafts only to be hunted down. Within a week, starvation led to savagery. Prisoners formed gangs, preyed on the weak, and they ate grass, bark, and eventually each other, removing meat from the deceased and roasting their victims. Horrified guards largely failed to intervene. Local Ostiak people reported an escaped woman whose calves had been severed and likely eaten. Of around 6,000 people stationed there, only 2,000 remained after 13 weeks. The deceased showed signs of illness, starvation, and cannibalism, leading to the nickname Cannibal Island, marking it as one of the worst man-made tragedies of the 1900s. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.